The air above Helmand in the summer shimmered like a furnace. By mid-afternoon, the dust turned the horizon into a pale blur. And every surface at Camp Leatherneck carried a film of sand so fine it seemed to breathe. Chief Warrant Officer 3 Avery Callahan walked across the flight line with her helmet tucked under one arm, her boots grinding against the packed dirt. The heat pushed down on everything, but she moved as if she had lived inside it her whole life. She was 29, lean, sunburned, and already worn in ways that had nothing to do with age. To most of the men who passed her, she looked too young, too slight, too quiet to be the kind of pilot who flew into combat. They called her soft behind closed doors. They had no idea Avery grew up in the desert outside Fallon, Nevada, where her father ran a small search and rescue service out of a hangar that smelled of oil and dust. He had been a helicopter pilot in Desert Storm, flying a Hughes 500 through sandstorms and tracer fire, and he taught her that flying was less about daring and more about judgment. He told her fear was information, that the difference between panic and precision often came down to 3 seconds of clarity under pressure. By the time she turned 16, she could lift off the Hughes and thread it through the mountain passes near Lake Tahoe. She learned to read wind by the way the dust swirled and to land on uneven ground without ever looking down. When she enlisted, people told her the Army Aviation Branch was no place for a woman. But she didn't listen. She passed Warrant Officer Candidate School, then went to flight school at Fort Novosel, where the instructors learned quickly that the quiet girl from Nevada could outfly most of them. She graduated top of her class in instrument navigation and tactical flight operations, earning her wings and her first Air Medal for Valor before her 25th birthday. Over 6 years, she logged more than 900 combat hours flying UH-60M Black Hawks in Afghanistan. Every mission she came back alive added a small crack to the wall of disbelief around her. Yet inside the command structure, the doubt never went away. That morning in Helmand, as she stepped into the operations center, the air smelled of coffee and dust. Maps covered the walls. Radios crackled with static, and officers stood clustered around a table, lit by the pale glow of monitors. She could feel their eyes glance up and move past her, as if she didn't belong. In the desert outside, the rotors of another helicopter cut through the heat, steady and low. Avery stood at the back of the room, her hands clasped behind her, silent but alert. The picture of composure, the men in front of her spoke in clipped tones, their words blending into the hum of machinery. She listened without interruption, her mind sharp and focused, aware that in a few hours she would have to prove, once again, that softness had nothing to do with strength. At Camp Leatherneck, the day started like any other, the kind of quiet morning that never lasted long in Helmand. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when the first call came in. Static cracked over the operations radio, followed by a voice tight with urgency. A marine company operating deep in Sangin Valley had walked straight into an ambush. The words came fast, each report worse than the last. A convoy of MRAPs was moving through a narrow stretch of road when an IED detonated beneath the lead vehicle, tearing through its armor and throwing debris across the column. Before the dust settled, Taliban fighters opened up from 3 directions, their PKM machine guns stitching the road with fire, while RPG-7 rounds screamed in from the ridgelines. Sniper shots echoed through the chaos, trapping the Marines in a shallow irrigation ditch with no cover and no room to maneuver. Inside the operations center, the air thickened as the scale of the disaster took shape. The first casualty count listed 40 wounded. 10 minutes later, it jumped past 100 placen. Within the hour, more than 200 Marines were down, some fighting to stay alive, others pinned beneath wreckage. Overhead, a pair of UH-64 Apaches tried to suppress the ambush, but the enemy positions were dug deep. Invisible among the mud compounds and poppy fields, 2 medevac birds had already attempted extraction and been driven back by heavy fire. The kill zone was sealed tight. Colonel David Ashford stood at the center table, arms folded, eyes fixed on the map. His jaw never moved. But his voice left no room for debate. No more flights in until air support could clear the area. Around him, officers nodded. Everyone knew what he meant. Sending another bird into that valley without cover was suicide. From the back of the room, Avery Callahan watched the discussion unfold. The walls buzzed with tension, the sound of overlapping radio chatter mixing with the thud of distant rotors outside. She had flown over that terrain enough times to know every wadi, every ridge. She also knew how fast men bled out when help didn't come. When she spoke, her voice was calm but firm, saying she could take a UH-60M in and get those Marines out. The heads around the table turned slowly toward her. Major Tom Kinsella was the first to answer, his tone sharp, his words deliberate. They didn't need a junior warrant officer with a hero complex, making things worse. The room fell quiet again, heavy with the kind of silence that carries judgment. Avery felt it press against her but said nothing. She stood still in the corner. The only sound, the faint buzz of the radio and the ticking of the wall clock that read 10:20 a.m. Around her, every man in uniform went back to planning. As if she hadn't spoken at all, the heat outside hit like a solid wall when Avery Callahan pushed open the door to the operations center. The light was blinding, the air thick with the smell of fuel and sand. Across the flight line, her UH-60M Black Hawk, Dust-Off 37, sat under the Afghan sun, its dark frame shimmering in the heat. Crew Chief Staff Sergeant Michael Pruitt stood by the open panel near the tail, running through the pre-flight checklist with a grease pencil tucked behind his ear. Specialist Luis Galindo was checking the feed tray of the left side M240H, ensuring the weapon was locked and clear. Inside the cockpit, co-pilot CW2 Ethan Huang adjusted the avionics panel and switched on the APU, the small turbine spooling up with a rising whine that cut through the heavy air. Avery moved with purpose. Every step, every glance was deliberate. She climbed into the left seat and leaned over the center console. Huang turned to her, his voice raised over the hum of the electronics. Asking if they had clearance to lift, she didn't hesitate. She told him they would by the time they were airborne. It was a lie, and he probably knew it. But the conviction in her voice left no room for argument. Pruitt caught her eye through the side window. He didn't ask questions either. He had flown with her long enough to know when she had already made up her mind. Leaving them to their work, Avery walked back across the tarmac toward the command building. Inside, the air conditioning hummed faintly, but it couldn't cut through the tension. Colonel David Ashford was still at the map table, his posture rigid, his focus unbroken. She stopped in front of him, boots clicking against the floor. She told him calmly that she was taking her aircraft and going in. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ashford looked up. His eyes were hard, his voice measured. He asked if she understood what she was saying. He warned that disobeying a direct order was a violation of Article 92, that she would face a full investigation. Avery stood straight, air voice even. She said she understood. He asked again, slower this time. If she really did, she answered that she did, but that watching Marines die while she waited for permission would be worse. Ashford said nothing more. He looked at her for a long second, then turned away. The silence that followed was heavier than shouting could ever be. When she walked out, no one tried to stop her. By the time she reached Dust-Off 37, the APU was running, rotors just starting to turn, slicing the air into waves of dust. She strapped into the seat, adjusted the cyclic, and glanced once at the horizon. On the radio, Ashford's voice came through, clipped and cold, warning her that if she lifted off, her career was over. Avery's hand tightened on the collective. She keyed the mic, said she understood, then eased the throttle forward. The rotor pitch deepened. The vibration grew stronger. And dust-off, 37 began to rise through the haze, pulling away from the ground and from everything that had once defined her. The moment dust-off 37 lifted from Camp Leatherneck, the world shrank to the hum of the turbines and the rhythmic slap of rotor blades. Avery Callahan kept her eyes on the terrain ahead, hands steady on the cyclic, body tuned to every vibration of the aircraft. The valley spread wide below her, a wash of brown and gray carved by dry riverbeds and winding wadis. She flew nap of the earth, hugging the contours of the land, never rising higher than 100 feet above ground level. At that height, a single wrong move could shear a rotor blade against rock. But flying higher meant exposing them to every PKM team and RPG gunner watching from the ridgelines. Inside the cockpit, co-pilot Ethan Huang scanned the radar and threat display, switching frequencies to keep the channel clear. His voice was calm, calling out headings and altitude changes. Behind them, Staff Sergeant Michael Pruitt and Specialist Luis Galindo moved with practiced precision. Pruitt checked the hydraulic lines and cargo straps, then loaded fresh belts into the M240H door guns. Galindo locked his harness and swung the barrel toward the open valley, scanning for muzzle flashes through the haze. The infrared camera mounted under the nose showed nothing but heat signatures, scattered like embers across the valley floor. Every mark could be a rock, or it could be a man with a weapon. As they closed on Sanjin, the radio filled with overlapping voices. Marines on the ground sounded winded, the words broken by gunfire. Their company was still pinned down in an irrigation ditch. Dust-off 37 was their only chance to get the wounded out. Avery adjusted her heading west of the main fight, choosing an approach path that offered the lowest angle for enemy fire. The ridges to the east were crawling with Taliban marksmen, but the western slope gave her 10 extra seconds of relative cover. 10 seconds was everything. The helicopter dropped into the valley, the altimeter spinning fast. Dust and sand whipped against the windshield, turning the world into a blur of beige. Huang called out the altitude, his tone tightening. Pruitt shouted that both guns were hot. Avery pulled back slightly on the cyclic, flaring at 30 degrees to bleed speed. The Black Hawk bucked, then settled into a hard landing on the dry riverbed they called LZ Reaper 1. The moment the skids hit the dirt, fire erupted from the hillsides. Bullets snapped through the air, punching into the fuselage with metallic thuds. The glass rattled. Pruitt and Galindo opened up with short bursts, sweeping their arcs to keep rounds from crossing in front of the cabin. The noise was deafening. A single unbroken roar of engines, gunfire, and shouted commands. Marines broke through the haze, carrying stretchers, dragging the wounded through the open ground. Avery kept her left hand steady on the collective, watching the torque gauge climb as weight filled the cabin. The engine strain was sharp and high-pitched. The smell of hot oil thickened the cockpit. Then a streak of smoke flashed across her peripheral vision. RPG. It hit 50 meters behind them, throwing a spray of rock and dirt over the tail. The shockwave jolted the aircraft. Alarms chirpit, and dust flooded the cabin. Huang yelled that they were loaded. Pruitt gave a thumbs up, his eyes hidden behind goggles streaked with grime. Avery didn't wait. She eased the collective up, pushing power into the turbines. The Black Hawk groaned, the rotors clawing for lift, and then they were airborne, rising through the storm of dust and tracer fire. The valley spun beneath them, glowing orange in the late sun. Avery banked west, skimming low again, the helicopter shaking but holding steady. Behind her, Galindo fired one last burst before closing the gun mount. As they cleared the ridgeline, the radio crackled with voices, cheering that the first bird was out. Avery didn't answer. Her jaw was locked, her pulse steady, eyes fixed on the horizon ahead. Behind her, LZ Reaper 1 burned in the distance, a black scar against the sand. The first trip into Sangin had left the helicopter scarred and shaking. But there was no time to dwell on it. Dustoff 37 touched down at the forward arming and refueling point, just long enough to drink fuel and reload. The ground crew moved like ghosts, faces streaked with sweat and grime. Staff Sergeant Michael Pruitt jumped out before the rotors stopped, patching holes in the fuselage with speed tape, while Specialist Luis Galindo cleared the empty shell casings from his side of the cabin. Chi W. Dewey. Ethan Wong ran a quick systems check, his eyes flicking across the hydraulic pressure and turbine readouts. Everything was running at the bare minimum of safety. But Avery Callahan didn't care. She stood beside the nose of the aircraft, helmet still on, eyes fixed on the western horizon. The heat waves shimmered off the tarmac. When Huang told her they were good, she just nodded, climbed back into the seat, and pulled pitch. The second flight was harder. The smoke from burning vehicles made the air thick and uneven. She kept the helicopter low, barely clearing treetops, skimming along the wadi to mask their movement. Marines on the ground popped smoke grenades to mark their position, and she dropped into the LZ fast, rotors slicing the haze. Galindo fired short, controlled bursts from the M240H to suppress movement along the ridgeline. Pruitt called out time to touchdown, his voice steady, even when rounds snapped through the open doors. The wounded came in waves, hands reaching, faces coated in dust and blood. Avery never looked back, only watched the gauges, counting seconds until they could lift again. They flew like that all afternoon. 7 missions in total, each one a blur of noise, heat, and fear held tight beneath the surface. On the 5th run, Avery's hands began to tremble on the cyclic. The vibration of the machine made it worse. Huang glanced at her and said quietly that he could take over. She didn't look up. She said she was fine. Her voice cracked just once, then steadied. The helicopter kept flying. By the 6th flight, Dustoff 37 looked like a relic held together by willpower and metal fatigue. A round tore through the tail boom, shaking the whole frame. Warning lights flickered, the hydraulic system screaming. Pruitt barked over the intercom that they were losing pressure. Avery kept her focus locked on the horizon, adjusting power to compensate. Galindo's bursts grew shorter to conserve ammo. Every sound became sharper. The rattle of the door gun, the groan of the turbine, the shallow breathing inside their helmets. When the 7th call came, the light was fading. The sky over Sangin turned the color of rust. The valley was still alive with small arms fire. But Avery didn't hesitate. She dropped Dustoff 37 into the kill zone one last time. Marines moved slower now, some limping, some carrying others. The cabin filled to capacity, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. The helicopter felt heavier than ever before, straining against the air. Avery lifted it clean, climbing through the haze as tracer fire arced beneath them. Back at Leatherneck, the landing gear touched down hard. The helicopter rattled like an exhausted animal. The air inside smelled of hydraulic fluid, sweat, and blood. There were 47 bullet holes in the fuselage, a cracked rotor blade, and a leak staining the tarmac beneath it. Yet every soul aboard was alive. Pruitt leaned his head back against the cabin wall. Galindo set his weapon down and just stared ahead. Huang exhaled slowly, his hands still on the controls. Avery sat motionless, eyes on the horizon. As the rotors slowed and the noise faded into the soft hum of the desert evening, for a long moment, no one spoke. The sun slipped behind the ridgeline, and Dustoff 37 sat trembling on the runway. The last heartbeat of a machine that had survived hell. The landing at Camp Leatherneck felt harder than any before. Dustoff 37 hit the tarmac with a jolt that rattled through the entire airframe, the sound of metal straining against itself. When the skids finally settled, Avery Callahan lowered the collective and let the turbines spool down. The cockpit filled with a low mechanical whine as the rotors began to slow, their motion softening from a roar to a rhythmic thump that faded into the evening air. For the first time all day, no one spoke. The cabin smelled of fuel and smoke, of metal and blood. Pruitt sat back against the bulkhead, his gloved hands resting limp on his knees, eyes half closed. Galindo leaned forward, staring at nothing, his face streaked with grime and exhaustion. Huang exhaled long and slow, his head pressed against the window frame, the glass still vibrating faintly beneath his helmet. Avery stayed in the seat for a moment, her hands still gripping the cyclic. Her fingers tremble, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. The adrenaline that had carried her through 7 flights was gone, leaving only the ache of fatigue and the hollow quiet that comes after chaos. She could feel the weight of every decision she had made pressing down on her. Outside, the desert air cooled quickly, the last light fading into streaks of gold across the horizon. When she climbed down, Colonel David Ashford was waiting beside the landing pad. He stood with his hands behind his back, the harshness in his face softened by something unreadable. He looked at the helicopter first, its skin torn and blackened, holes scattered across the fuselage like a map of where death had missed. Then he looked at her. For a few seconds, neither of them said a word. When he finally spoke, his tone was steady, almost quiet. He told her she had saved more lives in one day than most pilots did in an entire deployment. He said it as fact, not praise. Then he reminded her she had violated direct orders, an act that could lead to an Article 92 investigation. He paused, then added that he would recommend her for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and that given the circumstances, her actions fell under combat discretion. Avery nodded once and said she understood. Ashford studied her face for a moment before replying that he didn't think she truly did, but maybe someday she would. Then he walked away, leaving her standing in the soft wind of the cooling rotor wash. In the days that followed, the messages began to arrive. Marines she had pulled from Sangin wrote her from field hospitals and recovery wards. Some sent emails. Some found their way back to the base just to shake her hand. They called her the Angel of Sangin. Though she hated the name, she said she had only done her job. When the noise and ceremony faded, she often found herself walking the flight line alone at night. The runway lights blinked in the distance, steady and calm. The faint echo of rotor blades seemed to hum in the back of her mind. It was the sound of courage, not in the roar of engines, but in the quiet that comes after. 2 years after Sangin, Avery Callahan left the Army for the last time. She still carried the rank of Chief Warrant Officer 3, but the uniform felt heavier than it once had. The medals, the patches, the worn flight gloves tucked in her duffel, all told stories she no longer needed to prove. The war had left her body intact but had marked her in ways no one could see. She went home to Nevada, where the wind swept across the empty plains and the mountains glowed red under the late sun. There, she found work as a civilian flight instructor, teaching search and rescue techniques to young pilots who were eager and untested, just as she had been once. Her classroom was the open desert. The helicopters were old UH-1 Hueys, their frames rattling with age, their engines rough but dependable. She taught her students to read the landscape, to trust the rhythm of the wind, to feel altitude through the seat rather than the gauges. When the brownout swallowed visibility, she told them to keep their hands light on the controls, to breathe, to let instinct guide what instruments could not. She said fear was information, and the best pilots learned to listen to it. The young ones wrote her words down like scripture, but Avery only smiled. She wasn't teaching them to be fearless. She was teaching them to stay calm when everything went wrong. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, she heard the thump of rotor blades echo off the mountains and felt it in her chest. The sound brought back the heat, the dust, and the faces of the men she had carried out of Sangin, but the ache that came with it was no longer sharp. It had settled into something steadier, something she could live with. One afternoon, her father visited. He was older now, slower in his movements, but his eyes still carried the same steel. They flew together in his old Hughes 500, tracing the ridges and valleys that had shaped her childhood. The wind was strong, the air thin, and the silence between them said everything words could not. When they landed, he looked at her and said that what she did in Sangin wasn't just skill. It was faith. Faith in herself when no one else believed. She didn't answer right away. She just nodded, smiling faintly. Later, as she watched her students prepare for their own flights, she realized that her legacy wasn't in the medals or the stories others told. It was in them, in every pilot who would one day face fear and remember to breathe. The sun sank low over the desert, the same color as the dust that once clung to her boots. In that fading light, the world seemed to hold its breath, and the sound of distant rotor blades echoed like a memory that never really left. For Chief Warrant Officer 3 Avery Callahan, the war had ended years ago, but the lessons it gave her stayed alive in every heartbeat, in every student who learned to fly, and in every Marine who had walked away from Sangin Valley because she refused to give up. Courage, she learned, wasn't about breaking rules. It was about holding your ground when the rules no longer fit the moment. It was the ability to trust yourself when doubt came from every direction. In those hours over the valley, surrounded by fire and fear, she hadn't thought of glory or punishment. She thought of the lives waiting for her, of the voices on the radio fading too fast. That was what courage sounded like. Not loud or proud, but steady and clear. Avery didn't just fly into hell. She brought 340 men back from it. Her story reminds us that courage doesn't always live on the battlefield. It lives in the quiet choices we make when no one believes we can. And maybe the most dangerous enemy we ever face isn't the one with a weapon, but the moment we stop believing in ourselves